exactly is postmodernism? It's a much used and abused term. Often, most of the time, people use it without knowing what exactly it is. Now, postmodernism refers to it's a movement that began in the era after the Second World War. It lasted from the mid 20th century to the late 20th century. Like, it began during the 1960s and reached its peak during the 70s, and then by the 1990s, it was coming to a close, so to say. Now, the central idea of postmodernism is that it rejected totalizing systems of thoughts, like something, it rejected ideas like science could explain everything or God could explain everything. It also rejected this notion that value systems are the same everywhere. It rejected the notion of truth. It said that there's nothing called absolute truth. What is true for me may be a lie for you, and vice versa. And now postmodernism could be seen, elements of postmodernism could be seen in art, literature, philosophy, architecture, and in all fields related to the arts. Now, it is a reaction to the feeling or the belief that there are objective truths. Okay, so people believe during the Enlightenment period and later on that science could explain everything, that there are absolute truths, but there's objectivity. You can be objective in your approach to things. But postmodernism contested this notion and said that nothing can be certain. You cannot give a scientific explanation to everything. Objective facts are not always true. It varies from person to person, depending upon their background, their belief systems, and so on. Now, there's a central role is given to ideology and the question of power in postmodernism. As most of you might know, in postmodernism, there is a displacement of the center. Till then, there was always a center and there were some peripheries. Maybe the center was the Western world and the peripheries were the Orient. And the center might have been the upper classes or upper caste, and the lower classes or castes constituted the periphery. So postmodernism subverted this notion. It subverted this notion of the center and the periphery. And it also said that the center is not always the significant thing. You need not always have a center. The center was displaced. This idea of center itself is constituted by the question of power. Whoever is powerful, that becomes the central point around which everything else revolves. So the West, for instance, we are in the areas constituting the Indian subcontinent is referred to as South Asia. Now, it is South Asia from the perspective of Europe. So this term itself indicates how Europe has projected itself as the center of everything that's happening around the world. Now, postmodernism rejects such notions. Postmodernism was influenced by structuralism and also post-structuralism, and there are new things that are introduced by postmodernism, like deconstruction, which is a mode of reading, and some related terms also. Now, the term postmodern was first used by John Chapman to refer to a postmodern style of painting. Till then, the French Impressionist style of painting was very popular till the 1870s. So there was a new style that arose, and he simply used this term postmodern in a very generic sense to refer to something that is different from French Impressionism. Now, in the sense of a historical period, it was used by Bernard Bell in his work Postmodernism and Other Essays in 1926. Now, in the sense of a historical movement, now we use it in the sense of a historical movement in literature and the arts. It was first used by Arnold Toynbee in a study of history. He calls it, he says, our own postmodern age has been inaugurated by the General War of 1918. So he says that the postmodern era began from the First World War. Now he refers to it, he uses it to refer to postmodernism as a historical movement. Now Peter Drucker called it a nameless era. He said that postmodernism is a period between 1937 and 57, and you cannot name it. He just calls it postmodernism without even knowing that it would gradually become a term. Now, in the current sense, Lyotard used this term in his work, The Postmodern Condition, which is considered one of the central texts in postmodernism. Now, what are some of the major tenets and themes in postmodernism? skepticism and irony. Postmodern texts are very skeptical about established truths, and they use irony as a way of debunking certain existing notions and subverting existing systems that are brought into being by power and ideology. They also show an element of self-referentiality, where the text refers to itself, where the text tells you that, see, I am a text. I'm nothing, so-called real. I'm just a text. So for instance, there are works where we see the characters entering the book. Okay, that there's a writer and the character comes and talks to him and says, please let me enter this book. So this way it is telling you that, see, I'm a book, I'm a work of fiction, or I'm a text. So that's a way in which the text refers back to itself. Now, it's also known as metafiction, where there's a text within a text. Okay, there's a story, there's an embedded story, there's a story within a story, and sometimes the boundaries get very blurred. Now, there's a story where there's a person who is reading a book about two lovers, and the man is going to kill someone. So the man in the story leaves the cave to kill someone, and he comes to the room of the reader. Here we are confused as to what is real and what is fiction. So postmodernism offers these kind of possibilities to blur the distinction between reality and imagination, fiction and the outside world, the public and the private. Now, postmodernism is also characterized by a kind of pluralism and eclecticism. It accommodates differences. It brings a number of new things into together. It's not a singular notion. It accepts differences and diversity. Now, it also says that our social values, our values are socially contingent. It depends on the society in which you live. I've given this example earlier also. In ancient Greece, stealing was considered an art, and there were stealing competitions held. But now it is considered, in India, even at that time, it was considered a sin, to steal from someone else. So now your value system and what is right and wrong, what is ethical or not ethical, depends upon the society and a social order and the time period in which you are located. So postmodernism says that there is nothing called an absolute truth, or there's nothing called an absolute reality, or there's nothing called value. Okay, you cannot say that what I do is right or what you do is right, because there's nothing called right or wrong. Now, he says that interpretation plays a major role in creating reality. Everything is ultimately a matter of interpretation. If you interpret stealing as an art, yes, indeed, it's an art, right? So you present it in such a way, then it becomes the truth, it becomes the reality. But if you consider it as a sin and you represent it as such in books like the Vedas or the Upanishads, then that becomes a reality. So all this, the value systems and reality are all a matter of interpretation. There are no universally valid truths or values, according to postmodernists. Now, it denied a lot of Enlightenment ideas, such as, Enlightenment said there's an objective reality that is centered around maybe God or science or whatever. But postmodernism said there's nothing called an objective reality. Everything is a matter of interpretation, and interpretation varies from person to person. So as such, reality also varies from person to person. It is very subjective. You cannot talk about reality in an objective way and say that this is real or this is unreal, because it is all a matter of interpretation. So Enlightenment gave a lot of prominence to science and technology. People believed that science and technology would bring progress and the human race would develop. But what happened was actually the World War. With this belief that science could contribute to human progress, that science is an ultimate powerful entity, these kinds of notions were destroyed. Now, there was also this belief during the Enlightenment period in logic and reason. They considered rationality as being of prime significance. They also said that human beings are fundamentally, especially Western human beings, are rational beings. And, that is why they are located high up in the hierarchy. But Postmodernism rejects this notion that reason and logic are universally valid. What looks rational to the Western eye may not look rational to the Eastern eye. Okay, it may not look rational to the colonial countries. Now, postmodernism also rejected this idea that there is something called a human nature or essence. So, questions like what is the essence of being human? What is human nature? These kind of questions became very insignificant because postmodernism said there is nothing called human nature. It varies from person to person. Nature is again something constructed. It is not something that is given to you. You're not born with a certain nature. You're not born with a certain character. That is something that the society gives to you. For instance, the major argument that we are not born as men or as women, but we are constructed as men, as male and female, by social norms, by systems, by the social order. So there is nothing called a human nature that is given to us when we are born. It is all socially constructed. Now, postmodernism also opposed these notions like truth, morality, and it also talked about the binary oppositions. So, whenever we talk of some things, there's always an opposite to it. There's always something against which it is juxtaposed. For instance, black, white, west, east, or Occident, Orient. So, postmodernists said that these are fundamentally hierarchies. When we say black and white, black/white, it is not a simple phrase or a simple statement or a simple slashed sentence, or a clause or whatever. It is a hierarchy. There's a power structure inherent in it. The moment you say white and black, white is privileged over black. The moment you say west and east, west is privileged over the east. So these are not innocent ways of classifying things. These are all imbued with the question of power and ideology. So binary oppositions are fundamentally hierarchies according to postmodernists. Now, the postmodern theorists blurred the distinction between high art and low art. Earlier, there was this distinction, some things are considered high art, like classic cinema or art, and painting, some kinds of paintings, all these were considered high art, while pulp fiction or maybe comics, graphics, all these were considered low art. So postmodernism brought all these together and said there's no need for such a distinction. Okay, so the distinction between them, the boundaries between them were blurred. Now, today, earlier, like say 100 years back, a work like Chetan Bhagat's works would have been considered low art, but now it is even included in the syllabus. You cannot, terming it low art is politically incorrect. Terming anything low art is politically incorrect. So anything is a text, anything is art, So art as a category gained prominence, and distinctions between and hierarchies between various types of art started vanishing. The postmodernists also emphasized on subjectivity in art. Like if someone is writing a story about truth, the perspective of one writer would different from that of another writer. So there is subjectivity, the author's subjectivity. This author can never be objective. Also, a researcher can rarely be objective. Now, it also questioned meta-narratives or grand narratives, which dictated how the world should function. For instance, in the medieval period, a lot of importance was given to religion. Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution gave a lot of importance to science and technology. And later there were movements like Marxism, feminism. So postmodernism said that these kind of centralizing narratives or totalizing narratives, which try to explain everything, they're not really able to explain everything in the world. So postmodernists rejected such notions. They rejected such meta-narratives, which tried to explain everything in the world, which tried to obtain a centrality in philosophy and theory. Now, there was an emphasis on local narratives. Instead of something like science or religion explaining everything in the world, there was a focus on narratives that arose from specific areas, value systems that were relevant to certain specific places and certain specific time periods. And if you look at postmodern literature, you see yet another central theme in postmodernism: fragmentation and disorientation. So the world was more or less disillusioned with the Second World War, and they realized that science cannot explain everything as they believed earlier. So they realized that stability, unity, and coherence, these are all notions that might be unattainable. Okay, because human life, stability, everything is getting fragmented. So the world is on the whole getting fragmented. So this fragmentation and disorientation gets expressed in postmodern art and literature. The postmodernists talked about hyperreality and simulation. Now, this was a major contribution of Jean Baudrillard. He gave the example of an empire, of a colonial empire, which created a map. The map contained all areas of the empire. Gradually, some areas started detaching themselves from this empire. They gained independence, but still the map showed the empire as it was earlier. So gradually, the map became more real than the empire. The empire was vanishing. The empire maybe ceased to exist, but the map still existed. And the map became the idea of the empire. So the map is a simulacrum. Okay, so simulation refers to imitation, and simulacrum refers to the object that is used to imitate reality. Here, the map imitates the so-called reality of the empire. Now, they said that the postmodernists talked about a hyper reality. For instance, Disney World was created in America to show how America could be. It was a fantasy land. And if you look at the time during which the American Declaration of Independence and all were made, they believe that America is a land of dreams. So they believe that America is a fantasy world where everyone would get magical opportunities and magical experiences. So Disney World was created as a microcosm of that America. But that notion of America vanished, and Disneyland became the real America for people. So people started associating Disneyland with America. So here, Disneyland is the simulacrum. So postmodernists talked extensively about hyper reality and how our life has become an imitation. Now, they also said that there's nothing called an identity, or your identity. There's nothing called an identity that is given to you. Your identity is created by the social forces around you. You are made into a person with certain specific characteristics through the gender values that are given to you, the moral values that are given to you, the society and the time period in which you live. Okay, so identity is not a given. Human nature and essence are not given things. Now, Derrida talked about difference and deconstruction. Difference comes from the Greek word differere, which is used to refer to both difference, 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 and difference, difference, which means postponement. So Derrida argued that meaning arises from difference. A popular example being a cat is a cat because it is not a dog, because it is not a mouse, because it is not a bottle. Okay, so an entity, a word acquires its meaning through its differences from similar words. And meaning is constantly being postponed. You cannot fix upon a definite meaning because meaning keeps on being postponed. You cannot ever arrive at a concrete meaning. So Derrida talked about all this in his structure, sign, and play. And he introduced deconstruction as a mode of reading a text. Deconstruction focused on subverting or dismantling. It was not destruction, it was rather a dismantling of the text. It was a way of identifying the tensions inherent in the text. So postmodernists said that no text is coherent. Every text has tensions. Every text has contradictory points. Like for instance, if a feminist text says one should always be careful about his uh, ideologies. So here itself, the feminist idea of equality is subverted because you're using the language where you use the masculine term. You are privileging the masculine by using the term his and not her or his or one's. So it says that postmodernists say that any text has tensions inherent in them, and deconstruction is a way of uncovering these tensions. A text always deconstructs itself through these tensions. So opposing points come together, and ultimately we are left with a split text where its meaning is deconstructed. Now, as I said before, the lack of universal truths is another feature of postmodernism, and absurdity, which led to the creation of the theater of the absurd. Life is absurd. Life looks absurd and meaningless. Postmodernists said that there's no meaning given to you. The meaning arises through your interaction with the outside world, and you've gradually realized that life is meaningless. Life becomes meaningful only through your choices. There is no meaning given to it by any other force. Now, already mentioned some of the major postmodern thinkers like Lyotard, Derrida, Baudrillard, Jameson, Homi Bhabha, Michel Foucault. So you can talk for hours on each of these theorists. So we will move on to the major features of postmodern literature before we come to the crux of this lecture, the 5 or 6 movements that we were about to discuss. Metafiction, which I already told you about. Pastiche. Pastiche is not parody. It is a mixing. It's an imitation of. Various forms. Like if it is literature, it contains an imitation of other texts, but not in a mocking way, but in a celebratory fashion. Okay, it is imitation in a celebratory fashion. And intertextuality, where the meaning of one text depends upon the knowledge of the reader of a related text. For instance, if you need to understand the commentary at the basic level, if you want to understand the meaning of the commentary on T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, you need to have read the Wasteland first. So intertextuality. And if you see the essay on Truth by Francis Bacon, he begins it by a quote from the Bible, Justin Pilate, where Pilate asks, "What is truth?" Okay, so to understand the significance of that essay, you need to know this quote from the Bible. So intertextuality is when the meaning of one sentence or one text is dependent on your knowledge of another text. Now, there's a distortion of spatiality and temporality in postmodern literature. This you would understand if you read The Garden of Forking Paths by Borges, where space and time are twisted. You get confused. It's like you get lost in a labyrinth. Now, fragmentation, hyperreality, and fabulation, where you create stories, and an existential angst. All these are features of postmodern literature. There is an absurdity, and there's fragmentation, and people are constantly in angst. People are not happy exactly. People are constantly questioning the meaning of their own existence. Now, all this and magical realism, mainly advocated by Marquez, Isabel Allende, even Salman Rushdie. All these are features of postmodern literature. And there's a way in which postmodernism plays with narration and language. Sometimes weird language is used. For instance, in the play The Chairs by Eugene Ionesco, there is a gibberish that is being uttered by a character. It does not have any meaning, but it is a kind of play, or it kind of reveals that there is no meaning to life. Okay, if you try reading The Chairs, you will understand it towards the end of the play. Now, there are multiple points of view. Often the author does not tell you who is speaking. In one chapter, character X might be speaking. In the next chapter, character Y might be speaking. But you won't be aware of who is speaking, and then it leads to a lot of confusion. Now, hierarchies are challenged. And as I said, binaries are deconstructed. And there are a number of writers like Thomas Pynchon, Isabel Allende, Rushdie, Italo Calvino, who wrote a work called If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, which is highly metafictional and self-reflexive. And there are also texts where you can read from the beginning to the end, or from the end to beginning, and you can get the story either way. You can begin from chapter 5 or chapter 6 and go to chapter 7, but still you will get the story. So postmodernism plays a lot with language and the structure of the text and with narration.